will introduce our first speaker this afternoon. So our first presenter today is Dr. Ian Haslan. As a psychologist, Ian employs a research and evidence-based approach to leadership development, workshop design and organisational diagnostics to ensure quality and stickiness of knowledge. Ian has extensive experience in leadership assessment and development across organisations and has worked with employees just starting their careers through to experienced executive leaders in both public and private sectors. Please welcome Dr. Ian Haslan.
Thank you, Wendy. Rob. Thank you, everyone. I'm given another opportunity to hold you as a captured audience. You can't get away while I tell you exactly what I want to say. Hopefully, I'll make it somewhat useful and engaging as well. But I really just want to share some things that we'll be exploring and, I guess, experiencing and undertaking together as a group of workplaces through 2023. So my name is Ian Haslan, or Dr. Ian Haslan. Anyone who's ever spoken to me before will know that I will never once refer to myself as Dr. Ian Haslan ever again after that. So please keep the doctors out of the informality. Just Ian is fine. Call me literally anything except the Dr. Ian. Thank you very much. So I'm an organisational psychologist, a doctor of psychology, and I work as a principal consultant with Mappy, so I work with Jane here as well, member of the business. And I am presenting on, as I said, respected work of taking control of legislation and culture in 2023. And that is an extraordinarily audacious sentence. Taking control of legislation, control of culture. It's going to be an interesting experience going through this year, just on the back of the fact that there is going to be a lot of industrial relations and employee employment law reform through the year. And one of the first ones to drop, one of the first amendments to legislation to drop was the Respected Work Bill in, I think it was November 2022, towards the back end of it, being adopted through this year. And there's a lot of implications there, just for that one amendment, and also for the remainder of those reforms going through the year as well. And I'm not an industrial relations consultant. I'm not a lawyer. I'm not a law talking guy. I've been told that it's best if it stays that way as well. Organisational culture, leadership, the way that people act and think and behave at work is my forte. So we're looking at changing behaviour. We're looking at changing the way we think about our obligations and our responsibilities at work, and that is, by definition, a cultural question. So I want to unpack it. I want to look at what it really takes to adhere to this cultural change and the legislation through 2023, and how we can make that more simplified for us, small business owners, smaller organisations, less, I guess, moving parts, which makes things like adhering to legislation like this more complicated. And I really want to unpack that one and make it a bit more simple for everybody. Before I go, before I launch into it, we've got two Mentimeter questions that I wanted to ask you, and Wendy's going to switch over to that one for you now. First question is, what do you think will be the biggest challenge to business operations for you in 2023? Four questions there. Bit of a talent issue, you said.
Who's that one?
Do you think there's a trend there?
Yeah.
Structural.
Significant effect size. I'm going to throw some stats out there. That's massive. That's an enormous concentration. Attracting talent, retaining the ones that you have. Big elements of cultural viewing, a lens through culture with that one as well, which I'll get onto in a little bit. Has everyone had a chance to? Okay, attraction and retention. Fairly definitive. Right. We're on to the next question now. What do you think stands as the biggest opportunity for you and the business in 2023? Cultural development, capability uplift, less chaos, something else in reading groups. It's fascinating. Somewhat steady. Ability, cultural development.
Is that surprising to you, Ian?
I was just about to comment on the fact that less chaos and some breathing room, almost like just throwing that by the wayside. Like, no, it's not going to happen. So we're just going to pile more stuff onto our plates because that's what we're doing now. That's what work is these days. I like that it's somewhat evenly spread, but that capability uplift is, I think, really tied to, it's tied to cultural development, but it's also tied to the attraction and retention we were talking about as well, the application of the improvement of cultural experience. So what we experience as behaviour, as culture in the workplace, that features elements that will be there to retain. That features capability uplift as well. It's one of those primary engagement pieces that we have for our people. It's either being developed or being looked after. So I can see a lot of links in here, but what I am seeing also is an overwhelming sense that a shift in culture is going to touch on each of these as well. And I'm going to talk to the way that comes out of the necessary changes in behaviour, the legislation changes, the changes in law that govern how we are in the workplace and how we manage our people, support our people. But in doing so, we're able to touch on every single other facet of culture, everything that influences the way that we behave in the workplace and the way that our businesses grow and thrive and flourish. It's all in our hands with understanding exactly how to pull the levers to change culture in the way that we need to. So I do hope that I can address that one with you today as well. So I mentioned with the introduction of new legislation this year, or amendments to it as well, I want to give you a snapshot of what it looks like and how it's going to impact workplaces across Australia of every size and every industry. Because it's about how we are setting up our workplaces for success to ensure that the chances or the risks of a breach in respect, so sexual harassment, sexual discrimination, abuse, is lessened, it's removed. I'll talk to the framework that's been provided by the Australian Human Rights Commission. I'll talk about the support, the guidance, the frameworks that have been set up to give you a bit of support there, but to really peel it back to look at the way that they've structured this and how it refers to both a proactive and a reactive approach to managing respective work. But I'll talk to the idea that it is really an organisational culture intervention. Everything that we see and do with respect to how we behave here is by definition cultural. And taking a grasp of that in that way means we're giving ourselves less to do. We're creating more valuable and impactful actions that impact more than just the one outcome that we're looking for. And I'll speak to the framework they've given, but really take you through what it looks like as one that's done well and what those options are for applying and what it looks like realistically as well. We're not trying to take an enormous bureaucratic approach to really hitting the nail on the head and doing things exactly as prescribed. It's what's best for you. It's reasonable and proportionate actions. And what does that look like in terms of adhering to your obligations? But it really comes out of two big movements. And what happened in 2020 was a report was released, the Jenkins report, what is what it was referred to as. And it refers to some of the outcomes and the findings from the respective work study report, which really pulled out a lot of pretty significant stats in terms of prevalence, incidence, and the types of contexts that sexual harassment and sexual discrimination occur in. And surprise, surprise, it was significantly more harrowing and grim think, than most people might have thought or expected, or really expected to be put into a report. I think anecdotally, it is known, there is knowledge, but having it in black and white as a document that the Australian federal government was reviewing was a massive thing, and some of the stats in there were incredible. And so out of that report and out of the recommendations that came from it was the amendment to the legislation that governs such. It looks a little bit like this. So Respected Work report that came out was the Sexual Harassment National Inquiry Report for 2020, Jenkins report. And it led to some amendments that passed through lower and upper house for the Anti-Discrimination and Human Rights Legislation Amendment, the Respected Work Bill. So, like I said, I'm not an industrial relations consultant or lawyer. Stick out like a sore thumb up here. Thankfully, within Mapian, we have a lot of very clever, much more knowledgeable people around employee law in Australia, and they have helped me to summarise what the shifts are. But ultimately, what really the approach is, it's a shift in vibe. It's a shift in the way that we consider managing such behaviour in the workplace, to go from responding to and reacting to in a compliance sense, and shifting the view to a proactive approach to managing respect at work. What it means is the onus is on us as business leaders, as managers, as owners, to ensure that we're proactively managing the risks of sexual harassment, sexual discrimination, and ensuring that we are making sure that we can respect at work. And it comes in the form of a few different, more wide-reaching changes. So the first one there, as I mentioned, the proactive approach, is that we are obliged to show, we have a positive duty, so obliged to show that proactive, positive duty to prevent sexual harassment in the workplace. So number one, really shifts the tone. Number two there is that a hostile working environment is now a responsibility of ours to manage. As in, we have responsibilities now to ensure that on the basis of sex, we have made sure that our workplace does not unduly discriminate, lead to incidents of bullying and harassment, as far as is reasonable and practical. And third change is more powers that have been given to the Australian Human Rights Commission. And these powers are to provide guidance and support, which I'm going to show you through this session. They also have more powers with which to provide a letter of show cause, letter to essentially ask an organisation to provide some insight and guidance on how they've managed and controlled for these risks. And the third one is to refer to send a request to federal courts to be able to compel you to show that evidence. So they've really been armed with the weapons to be able to push this through as well. So essentially the obligation is there. We need to make sure that we're taking a proactive view. We need to make sure that our behaviours, that what we do as leaders and managers in the workplace, shows that dedication to proactively removing and limiting, that we are coming from a point of view of we want to make sure there's total transparency. We're listing, we're understanding where our risks are, we've got appropriate controls in place that are suitable and reasonable for the size and the function of our business and who we are and what our culture is. All of that's very complex and complicated. So what we do know is that with that broader and very, I guess, wide-reaching change to legislation, there's a need to guide, there's a need to provide some support, which comes out of recommendation 48 of the Respected Work Report.
Ian, is that a catch-all? That is, if you employ somebody at a workplace, you're bound by this. It's got nothing to do with 50 or more, right?
That is correct. Any workplace in Australia are bound by these legislative changes now. Yeah. And that's where the danger comes, because it's got a lot of provisions and a lot of guidance and support for very large organisations. Multi-region, multi-site, we're talking in the realms of hundreds/thousands. But counterintuitively, it's kind of harder to apply those changes to a much smaller organisation. There's less in the way of systems and processes to augment. It might be less mature human resources policies or just systems and processes the way that we do. A lot of small businesses do not launch, do not become successful once they've been around. Well, we've got a lot of small business owners who just have little to no knowledge at all of legislative change, what their obligations are. It's a really dangerous position to be in. But it's applying to all workplaces, and the kicker there is that it's reasonable and appropriate controls and actions. So everybody is expected to the extent that their business size, function, it would be reasonable and appropriate. Within financial costs, within time constraints, within just bodies and people being there to be able to help with these changes. But that obligation is still there. So how do we do this? How do we look at the frameworks that are given? And there's a lot of material I'll cover in a little bit. But there's so much to look at. There's so many things to consider in terms of shifting the dial, shifting how we look at things. How do we apply this? What does it look like? What am I physically doing? That's where the gaps are. That's where the knowledge gaps are. So what they did was to aid this, they were to create this framework to provide at least the smallest amount of it. It actually ended up being a really great resource. There's a website out there now, and you can look it up for yourself. There's an enormous amount of very helpful information on the Respect at Work website, which really takes you through the full story and where the report came from, what the outcomes were, and how this was implemented into legislation, and pretty much every recommendation it was. It was very, very wide-reaching, and it was all taken up. But they recognise that this is a big change, and we're being asked to enforce this quite quickly. So a framework was provided, and it really does highlight the fact that we're drawing this attention away from just having the rules and policies there and acting once something happens, to ensuring. And it's referred to as the positive duty from like a Safe Work Australia point of view. So that positive duty to ensure a safe workplace physically. It's being extended to safe in the psychological and psychosocial sense as well, from that gender-based discrimination and harassment. But really what I want to emphasise quite strongly is that the name of the game is prevention and proactivity. And we can't proactively engage with the sorts of functions and controls within our business that are going to impact on these behaviours if we don't look at them from a cultural sense. It's a cultural change. Every behaviour that we exhibit, that we make, that we see as well, is some artefact of our cultural experience in our workplace. As leaders of that culture, we can change it very, very easily if we know what levers we're pulling. But we only know what levers we're pulling if we do the very hard thing, which is to understand what our culture is in the first place, what it looks like, what the behaviours are, whether it's appropriate or not, whether there's scope for improvement, whether it's comfortable, whether it's helpful for our purpose and for our why we're here. So all of these things, again, floating around in the air, we're looking at them, we're looking at the positivity that comes from culture, we're looking at legal changes, the way that we have to and are forced to oblige to change the way we manage. So to bring it all together, the Respect at Work framework to help was created, and this is developed by the Respect at Work committee, and this is on that website now. You can see that there's a lot of emphasis then on the prevention side of things. You can see leadership, risk assessment and transparency, culture and knowledge. Knowledge upskill, so capability uplift comes in there as well. It overshadows and outweighs the response side of things, which is still quite important. I'll go through those as well, but the support, reporting and measuring are all less arduous. They're more in the moment, and they are almost like policies or mechanisms for after. It's a set and forget almost sort of a thing. Where the effort comes in is shifting the behaviours around the other areas of that framework. And I look at leadership, I look at the knowledge or the growth culture or the growth mindset of a business. The risk assessment and transparency from the point of view of understanding exactly what's going on in our business and being transparent about that as well, both internally and externally. These are all really heavily laden in cultural artefacts, as in, we do this here because that's what we do here. But it's not necessarily baked into the way that we have to run a business, it's how we choose to. The way that we manage that makes these changes much easier to implement. When I look at it though, I think it's culture. If we look at all of these changes through the lens of how do I shift behaviour in my business through a cultural lens, it's the way that it works. So culture has so many different definitions. It's very hard to keep up, and it's even more difficult to understand what culture is in the first place. And you've got that very consistent, is it engagement, is it climate, what is it? We can describe a culture as our culture. Heaps and heaps of definitions. There's Edgar Schein, grandfather of cultural measurement and understanding and academics in the world, passed away recently, just by the way. But he had a definition in a lot of his textbooks, fairly wordy. A shared pattern of basic assumptions which group members have acquired over time as they learn to successfully cope with internal and external organisationally relevant problems. It's really full meal of a sentence there. It doesn't get much better, consisting of the values, beliefs and norms, blah, 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 blah. The way that we have always spoken about culture, I think just in my experience, and it's just easier to run out as well, it's the way we do things around here. So in terms of defining culture, is that the one that we're most used to? The way that we do things around here? It's spot on. It's fairly accurate. It's just, it's the common, consistent behaviours. It's a very kind and nice definition though, and I have been subscribing for the last couple of years to the one below it, because it's a bit more punitive than that sometimes, culture. Because if you go with culture, it's great. If you're against, that's where you start coming up against some dangers, some issues, and you can see the rifts, the silos, etc. I love the definition, the behaviours that we are expected, to show to fit in here. So we're expected to show these to fit in. But if we don't adhere to this set of behaviours, we're done. We're not going to fit in, we're on the outside, we're in the out group. We don't identify as part of the group, we start seeing a lot of those kind of bad outcomes there. But it doesn't really matter if it's good or bad, we fit in because it's the things that we have to do to fit in around here. That's what culture is. And if we can take a hold of that and grasp that and shift it, adhering to respected work obligations will be what we're expected to show to fit in around here. Like that's the way that it works. It's an expectation and you act according to that. And again, it's tricky because it's not a lot of these things. Is it engagement? No, it's not. Engagement is literally satisfaction or a degree of satisfaction with a set number of things that we've asked questions on. That's engagement with satisfaction. It's great. We want to know about engagement. We want to know that very frequently, at least annually. But it's not culture. Is it climate? No. Climate is about the sensation. It's about the feeling. It's literally, it feels a bit chilly today. It's a bit cold in his office right now because no one's talking. That's the climate. It's the indicator of how I'm perceiving my experiences here, how I'm living. The biggest one also, and this is why a strategy and having policies and compliance measures and controls in place there. This is why culture will always, it'll always eat it. It'll always totally consume it. Culture eats strategy. You can have any plan that you want, but what's consistent behaviour is going to steamroll right through that because we've set that example already. Verbalising, here's what I want you to do, while the river is just streaming past with all of these behaviours that we've become ingrained in the business, it's not going to change at all. Culture will eat strategy. You need to look at the culture first before then setting in place any kind of a plan. Having a grasp of what that culture is super critical, super important. And so the way that we look at culture, and I'm just going to flash this up really quickly, I'll come back to it in a little bit, but this is going to provide you a bit of a picture of why it's difficult to look at culture and measure it and define it as well, because it comes a little bit backward. It's not an outcome that you can just have and you can do things to, and then you can see the difference immediately. Great, I've just fixed my culture, fantastic. The reason it's challenging is because it's so ingrained in the very purpose of our business and what we hold to be important. And culture in a business is the collective average of all of our behaviour. It's the way that all of that behaviour culminates in how we describe the culture. So it starts with a purpose. Why do we exist? What do we have that we offer? What is our value? Why are we here in the first place? Business purpose. What stems out of that and what must be applied directly to that why, to the purpose of being is, well, what's important to me as well? But these things are really emotive. It starts with that emotional piece. Why do I exist? What's important to me? And making sure that those values are documented, but that they're clear, that they're consistent, also that they're adhered to, values in action, and that they're aligned to our purpose and aligned to where we want to go. So we have our why, we have our values, and that's fine. That's fairly abstract though. It's kind of, well, what do I think is important? Before we get to culture though, because culture is an output, it's a behaviour, right? So a behaviour is an output, there's some inputs in there. And the way we conceptualise this is by certain levers of culture. There are 6 levers that we pull that really touch on every aspect of your experience in the workplace. Leadership culture, how do our leaders behave? How do they interact with each other? How do they work together, collaborate? How do they work with other teams, direct reports, and all of those sort of cultural considerations. If you think about, for example, a state government organisation, I'll use one from hometown, Queensland, where I would be coaching a senior leader who was having a real drama because he couldn't talk to his manager once removed. It was culturally completely inappropriate, and if you did that, you were immediately reprimanded quite harshly. That is a cultural artifact, not being able to talk to your manager's manager. Other organisations have obviously either a flatter structure or a much more open policy than that. Anyone can do anyone. That's all a cultural artifact. It's the way that leadership is done. It's specific behaviour. Just an example. The way that we manage capability development, capability uplift. What is done here? How do we do this? What do we plan? What do we talk about? Another piece of the puzzle. Well-being experience. What do we do in the workplace to manage well-being? And again, this is one of those areas, those areas of experience and behaviour that influences culture, but then you can see that there are links already to the way that we manage well-being for everyone in the workplace, respective work. Accountability, again, this is how we manage accountability for performance, for doing well, for not doing so well as well. What is the mechanism behind ensuring accountability and productivity? What do we do? Is it conversations, coaching conversations? What mechanisms are in place? Again, proactive and reactive at the same time. Systems and processes, literally your policies. What do you have set in place? What are your systems? What are your controls? And the work environment itself, which is not just well-being experiences, but physically how comfortable we are. And all of those things then, once impacted and managed and manoeuvred in various ways, produce what we see as cultural outputs. So stories that people tell, certain symbols that we have around the workplace, what we have in terms of rituals, routines, what's our operating rhythm, how often do we meet, for example. That again is a cultural input. Do we have stand-ups every morning? What kind of an environment is it day to day? What power structures are there? Again, the hierarchy, the organisational design, almost. Our sense of identity with the business, and also the controls that we set in place. The impact then, obviously, I've taken you through the full journey there, but the outcome, the outputs of our cultural experience obviously come out in things like business performance, the people performance, engagement, and so on. Big concepts, but the idea being we start with a purpose and what we know is important to us. These 6 levers here are what we can push or pull or change or hit in order to manage our culture. And this is where we start seeing the links to how we can change little things sustainably to have bigger behavioural changes along the way. And that's what I mean. It's much more impactful across a broader group of people and more sustainable if we move to that proactive approach. So from an individual level, we are managing health and well-being, ensuring everybody has that. And when I say personal finances, I mean, if you have a bad experience in a workplace and it has anything to do with sexual harassment or discrimination, it has an impact financially because you're more than likely going to have some difficulties with employment there. You'll need to find another place, another organisation. It's complicated. And then implications for ongoing life experiences, comfort as well. For the broader organisation, again, financial and productivity elements are improved, but again, it comes from culture, and you can speak to that. And down to the reputation and brand kind of approach there, this is where that attraction piece comes in as well. It's the fact that if your culture is strong and you're seen as being a strong brand, you're seen as being an employer of choice, a lot of these will come down to how well the culture is perceived. And so to come back to that framework, again, we want to look at each of these elements, these pieces of the puzzle. The leadership, again, the way we lead, this is obviously a cultural piece. Taking the view of proactive risk assessment is the one specifically called out a piece of proactive behaviour that we need to do. Managing our culture as a part of this framework. Again, we've got some really good concepts to grasp on now. And knowledge, so that uplift, the growth mindset of just knowing and understanding more. I like knowing everything. It's a foreign concept to me to not just want to know more about that thing, because I just need to know everything. It's got to be in my brain. But not every person, not every organisation is housed with people like this. The more we know, the more that we can see through those changes, the more that we can have that insight and actually change our behaviour as well. But that first one, leadership. Before I move into it broadly, culture starts at the top. You know, when I say that culture is our collective average of our behaviour, it's led by the leadership team, right? But what they see, that modelling, it's social learning. It's like how, and it's an analogy that some people are aware of, but if you see your parents doing something to growing up, you copy that behaviour. It's social learning, it's modelling. The very same concept translates to organisations as well, to organisational leadership. It's really that same modelling. They're the authority, they're in charge. Acting as they act is appropriate because that's what's expected. So modelling the appropriate behaviour is always going to be a strong choice, but coming from the way that we communicate at the same time as leaders, we are the most impactful cultural ambassadors in the organisation. So leading by example is super important, but understanding that literally everything that we say and do is viewed by our people, by our organisation, as our peers, as our connections, as a piece of that cultural puzzle. Understanding everything that we do impacts on how people perceive us and our people and our business is rule number one. But knowing exactly what it is about leadership ability, about why we lead well, brings about a few different realizations as well about how to do this well. So, talking about how you know when leadership looks like it's being performed well, I guess you're doing leadership well. You see a lot of trust. You see a lot of trust between yourself and people back. So that baseline of trust comes out of things like knowing yourself, knowing that you need to continually develop and understanding what's important, putting voice to that. Modelling that behaviour and speaking to that behaviour via communication is also key. So when I say that understanding others and perspective taking is something to model, that's exactly what we want to do. Okay? Having that understanding that our communication is, well, there, it's the window to your thinking, it's the window to your intentions. If you understand exactly how to communicate your point of view in a way that people will actually grasp, how do you appeal to and influence a group of people? It's a really strong piece of communication skill for us to know. And as a leader, the way that we influence others might look different, but that's the output. We are grabbing onto their attention. But making sure, again, that we're managing our accountability to our obligations and modelling that, but making sure that our firm boundaries are there and ensuring that our policies and our views and the way that we want to do things is being communicated well and being listened to and understood. It's one of those primary and key responsibilities for leadership. In terms of bolstering this and understanding how to provide some action and intervention at that leadership level to ensure that we are maximising leadership culture to be able to support respective work. There's a couple of ways, and these will be fairly consistent with what a lot of people know, in the sense that training and leadership training and coaching and education is one of the forefront ways to manage and bring about that capability up with that leadership layer of our group. So just understanding what it is that drives sexual harassment, what to look out for. Most difficultly, I think, how to start a conversation. So a really challenging piece of skill to have is that you see somebody acting in a way that's not against policy, it's not against code of conduct. It might be a little bit against values and what we have as an organisational value, but it's not something that can be, that you can't come down on. For example, how do you start a casual conversation about behaviour that's approaching a value clash? It's a challenging conversation to have. You can't necessarily say, can't do that. but how do you have a supportive conversation with somebody about what they're doing, which isn't exactly on the mark, but it's not crook behaviour either. You know, it's a challenging piece. The approach to leadership development is, you know, fit for purpose, horses for courses, depending on what your business is, where the leadership gaps are, and what the individual approaches to the different people in your business are as well. The coaching and mentoring approaches, that kind of thing. Full-fledged development programs, but those skills they'll specifically focus on the respected work obligation. So having those conversations, as I've said, having that knowledge bank, understanding that it's to be set into the rhythm, you know, the annual, the quarterly, or the half rhythm of what we're measuring in those background processes, but making sure that everything in there is aligned exactly. We don't have pieces clapping. Leadership's a big one, as is this piece here, which is around the assessment of risk and the transparency of those assessments also. And this is a piece of the cultural and the proactive aspect to respected work, which might be a little bit foreign and different. I say this because this is now a thing that we have to do. It is new. It's taking the proactive approach to managing and seeking out within our businesses where those risks are, for a sexually based behaviour to consider. So for example, taking the view that if we implement an assessment piece, or just essentially analysing our risks and ensuring that our controls are set in stone and are appropriate and proportionate as well. This is it's a piece that we can put into any other existing business processes as well, but it's just something that we need to think about at the same time. And it's not just for, again, the bigger organisations. So for a much smaller, an outfit between say 5 and 10, for example, this process might not be, you know, a drawn out, wide-reaching thing. It might just be quite casual, but the idea is that either way, we're proactively taking a look at where our risks may be, based on what we know drives sexual harassment and sexual discrimination, and ensuring we document that. Where this slots in really nicely is within the same framework as what Safe Work Australia has put together. So from that physical side of things, and taking into account their work on psychosocial risks as well, looking at risk assessment and action from a whole WH&S perspective is a good way to slot this in as a part of another process there as well, while taking a dedicated view towards those behaviours at the same time. But in terms of doing it well, there's been a fairly nice model put together on the Respected Work website for guidance as well. They really highlight the idea that identifying the risks and giving you a lot of tools as well. There's a couple of identification tools, guidance, guidelines as well, and even templates and pro formas you can use at the same time within the same website. It's very, very handy. I've actually never seen that much support material from a government website ever before that was actually quite good. It's so good that it's quite overwhelming in the depth of how much is there, which makes it, it's a double-edged sword, but there's plenty there if you know what you're looking for. But identifying and using the tool they provided, if so, assessing also, and being quite, being brutal with yourself. And is there a chance that there is a risk here? But no, not in my organisation, of course in your organisation as well. That's the way that it works. Not making any assumptions and making sure that we are quite transparent with what we're doing and recording it as well against the past. Ensuring that the controls there are preventative and also appropriate. So they're not over the top, they're not pie in the sky sort of a thing, and it's in terms of budget, in terms of time, it's proportionate to your business and its processes. And being transparent, that transparency and consultation as well with our people is critical. In terms of measuring and in terms of showing what we're doing, if we don't show that transparency, and if we don't have that consultation piece with them as well, again, that comes to the communication aspect. And it's a big piece of trust as well. So again, if you're not showing that level of insight and you're not consulting as well as you could with your people and taking them along in the journey at the same time, you're in danger of damaging the culture that you're trying to address and amend at the same time. And so the way to do this, and again, we're not about wasting time here, so you can obviously co-opt other processes. You know, as a part of your safety risk assessment, so taking that from the Safe Work Australia framework, it's a really good way to go. Component of a broader cultural review. So again, coming at it from the point of view that we want to measure this culture, we want to be able to describe it. And this doesn't take a pre-selected engagement survey, you've got to do it properly, right? And it's got to be hard. It's difficult. If it's difficult, you know that you're on the right track pretty much. But in terms of co-opting those processes, it's not about taking away from either of them as well. So if it fits, it fits. But otherwise, a regular or standalone event that forms as a part of that operational rhythm, the BAU. Making sure that we can identify, assess, the type of understand, control and review. And again, there's some really good support resources there. But those strong indicators of culture, again, the work environment, the systems and processes that we set up, the leadership culture and the way that we apply accountability as well. And all of these things have a massive impact on the way that we then assess our risks. And I say that there's a lot of material there. This is just an excerpt from one of the documents, but it's a very wide-reaching check, as in a risk tool, to be able to then identify, is there a risk, is there not, and what my controls are. But things like workplace characteristics, the composition, as in our team composition, the trends in our workplace, things like workplace requirements, things like, where's the other one there? Different uniforms, for example, for different genders. And it speaks to the driving force that a lot of the research behind the report put out there, which is the two primary drivers of sexual harassment discrimination tend to be that there is a power imbalance of any type in the organisation, which organisations are hierarchical, right? So those power differentials exist everywhere. So the very existence of power differentials is a predictor of such behaviour. And gender imbalance as well. So differences in proportion of male to female. Those two factors are the biggest drivers of sexual harassment and discrimination behaviour, shown by quite a lot of research. There's a few others obviously down the descended list, but those are the two primary, and obviously the biggest drivers of the risks there as well. So culture, again, I won't dwell on it too much, but this is again a piece of that framework where we know that if we adjust our cultural approach, it's going to have a massive impact down the line, not just on respective work type outcomes, but anything we want to accomplish. So culture eats strategy, and it also eats any planning, and it also eats your policies, and it also eats your good intentions. Because you could want to change, and you could want to go down another path, but the river's going that way. So that behaviour is very entrenched, and it takes smaller, sustainable, iterative changes to get it back to where we want to go. Because it is the behaviours that we have to display to fit in around here. So it's well worn. It's it's like a highway of behaviour. We can't carve out a dirt road, a corrugated path over this side without trailing it just as much. So in terms of organisational culture and doing it well, it means that you've got an understanding of what it is. So if you haven't measured it, measure it. Understand what you've got there in your business. And know that comfortable culture does not equal necessarily an ideal culture. So where we have in the middle there a culture which generates the behaviours that make us comfortable, that drive us towards where we need to go, that is an ideal culture. But if it's just nice to be there, but it doesn't necessarily result in good business outcomes, it's just a nice place to be, it's not necessarily a good fit. When you do go to influence culture, it's inertia, it's changing things, so you've got to expect a bit of backlash. People will be uncomfortable with stuff. That's the way that it works, and communication around that is key. But understanding then that the interventions and the desired state where we're going, it's going to be unique, but either way, it'll be led by our leaders from the get-go. It must be led by our leaders because, again, they drive that culture. They are the ambassadors of culture, me. And again, the fundamentals don't change. Safety and well-being, the behaviours around that, diversity and inclusion, and making sure that we address those two biggest proponents, that are power differentials and gender inequality. So the way to do this, again, if you want to understand your culture, a culture review is the way to go. And the way that these work is pretty significant in the sense that they are widely varied. It really depends on what the business is and how we run, what we have here that changes how we measure our culture. But if we're talking about behaviours, we're on the right track. If we are having trouble designing and actually getting the information and doing anything with it, it is difficult to do that, but probably on the right track as well, because it is notoriously hard to measure culture, and it really relies on an experience and an observation of behaviour and how this changes. I could talk for hours on culture, by the way, in case you hadn't noticed. Having an understanding of our team and how we interact, another massive cultural piece. If we understand each other, we know how to talk with each other well, and as a leadership team, this really bolsters that leadership culture approach and how we do it. And again, coming at our culture framework, almost everything that we've been talking about in terms of the changes that we're making so far do fit along these cultural themes. And again, understanding where we are, who we are, what our different styles are, both in an organisation broadly within our teams, then also within our leadership teams, also knowing each other to this degree. This is how we demonstrate a united behavioural front at the same time, just knowing who we are and how we are and how we do. Knowledge is the fourth big proactive approach here. And again, it really speaks to a cultural drive of people within our business wanting to know more, wanting to understand more, peering under the hood a little bit further to understand what's going on, why and how. If we as a business know what those drivers are, what behaviours are expected and why we're doing what we're doing, we find that again, that knowledge or the input of that knowledge means that behaviour changes almost just because we know that behaviour will change because of the knowledge. Insight creates change. Insights for ourselves and our businesses create change almost automatically. That feedback from our behaviour happens. Knowledge does change attitudes. It changes what we think is important. And in terms of sharing the knowledge, in terms of doing it well, having some thought behind it. So not just an online module, not just a quick presentation that goes for 45 minutes. Properly innovative, engaging, but fit for purpose with outcomes. Learning is really where you want to go, and the way this comes out, I'll show you in a little bit, but again, the focus there on the drivers of sexual harassment, recognising risk factors, recognising behaviours and seeing where those markers are, and a focus on the controls that you've chosen also. So understanding then that we're spreading the knowledge to others. What have we put in place and why? Why are these changes being made? What are the outcomes and what are the positivities that we're trying to bring from this? And delivering this well, it can come in all forms. Okay? We know about the coaching side, we know about formal learning, but the way that we bring in information is quite wide and varied and can surprise you as well sometimes. A lot of learning via osmosis, but the informal learning that happens in just shadowing the day-to-day work, the micro-learning, social learning, specific projects that are set aside and for ongoing discussion and action as well. So a lot of these things would transfer knowledge, but it's really about what's fit for purpose and right for you and your business and your culture. I won't dwell on these next three. They're quite well known and again reactive and responsive to these things. But the way that we provide support, and this is support to people who have made a complaint or the people who are most vulnerable and at risk of these behaviours, the way that we respond to that has an impact on well-being, and a flow-on is our reputation, our brand as well. The way we look after our people is known. How we support is an indicator of our culture, absolutely. But making sure that it's focused on the people themselves, so that person-focused support, rather than organisationally focused, compliance-based support. So by that I mean empowering your people to help make the decision in how they're supported. Ensure that their confidentiality and their safety is ensured as well. And to make sure that you take that more flexible approach as well. Ensuring that you flexibly account for what's required for your people, and rather than fitting into a cookie-cutter strategy. Reporting is similar. The passage or the friction involved in reporting an incident for people can be just as damaging as the incident itself, because there is that sense of not being understood or heard. The way we look after reporting and ensure those pathways are free and clear and accessible and confidential is super critical. Again, the way that we choose to handle reporting, and the way that we put those steps in place is a self-report of ourselves, of the way that as a business we see those sorts of behaviours and how we want to handle them efficiently. And again, I won't go through all of these. A lot of these pieces are available on the website as well. But it's essentially a step-by-step. How do I make sure that the mechanisms that I have in place for my people, I don't need to touch, I don't need to hear. It's just super easy. It's not a difficult or arduous task, and people feel supported and listened to. And the very last one there is measuring. We refer to this as simply capturing data on those incidences so that we can report on it, so that we can look at it and act accordingly. In a reactive rather than identifying risks, but more of that identifying actual incidences point of view. And the idea here is that it's not just incidences itself, scientific approach which we like a lot, it's from all sorts of different data entry points. So I've got a couple of different examples there, but any indication that we have in our organisational knowledge and the way that we refer to our data can show us what these behaviours look like if they come out. But what I wanted to leave you with is the fact that every single piece of this framework really does speak to one of those levers of culture. If we want to pull a cultural lever, we know what they look like, but they also have impacts on the way that we do view respected work and the way that our businesses will manage that moving on as well. And as I said, we've got an obligation this year, from this year ongoing, we must show that proactive prevention of sexually based discrimination and harassment. And so this is where we get it. The very last thing I want to leave you with, because there's a lot of material there, and there's even more on the website, and I could talk again for another hour or two or three to mention. There are some things to look at and to manage for ourselves, to feel that we're comfortably dealing with the changes, at least at that top level, so that we are doing what we need to. We're following our responsibilities and adhering to our obligations. And the very first one, again, as you've probably seen, it's worth knowing that at a foundational level, we do need to review and update our current policies, regardless of how complex or how simple or how mature they are, to make sure that we do adhere to our legislative requirements. Understanding more about the drivers is one of those things that's going to change behaviour. As I've said, knowledge is key, and training and capability is key here. So knowing exactly what leads to these behaviours and what our responses are, how proactive management looks at this, and what it is that we put in place in the first place. All of these things require training and knowledge, and these things need to be updated consistently. So it's again another one of those pieces. But ensuring as well, and this is that co-opting other processes thing, that any safety risk assessment that we're conducting naturally includes psychological safety risks as well, so psychosocial risks and the risk factors of these sorts of behaviours at the same time. And making sure that we're measuring and monitoring all incidences rather than leaving them undocumented. We've got a little bit over time there, so we did probably as well.
We did.
But,
Could listen for hours.
that's the one.
Sure we do.
Thank you very much, guys.
Yes, thank you.